Alright, let's take a look at this battery rack that I welded together. Was really excited to finally get it done. I'd been looking at how to put the batteries underneath the van for a long time. Just couldn't do it, but finally got it done. So I started off with a 19mm socket and took down the little bracket that holds the spare tire cage on. There are two brackets towards the front of the van that I had to take out, which you see here. And taking those out allowed me to pop the tire rack off and completely out. These two metal flanges I ended up having to remove, so I cut them off and ground them down. They interfered with the batteries when I raised the battery up in this area, so I also removed this bracket completely. You can see a little shot of the spare tire rack here and the bracket that held it up here. So those both came out. Here I'm taking a 4.5-inch angle grinder with a sanding disc on it to take the undercoating underneath the van down to bare metal so I have a nice surface to weld to. There were 6 vertical supports, so I'm sanding 6 specific areas. This is looking towards the front of the van from this perspective. Here are the 6 spots all cleaned up and ready to have the supports welded. This is the middle here, and you'll see the 2 spots facing the back of the van there. Next, I'm going to take the 2x4 here and line it up with a mark I made on the center of the van. The 2x4 is the width that I want the battery rack, and I made a mark on the center of that 2x4, which I then line up with the center mark that I made on the van, so that I know I'm welding the vertical supports exactly where they need to be, and it makes it a lot easier making sure they're the exact distance apart when I have both supports on. So that was just a little trick that I used to try to make my life easier, and I'll leave the video running so that you can see the process of welding all 6 supports on. Here are all 6 of the vertical supports welded into place. Running out of room under there, but still managing to get the job done. I left all of those supports a little bit long so that I can trim them down after they were in place. This ensured that I would have a level rack even if the bottom of the van wasn't exactly level. So I'm taking the 4.5-inch angle grinder with the metal cutoff wheel, and I'm cutting all the vertical supports down to the final size that I want them to be. So this will take just a minute. Listen to some more music while I get it done. Now I have the vertical supports welded to the van and cut down to size. I have the vertical supports of the bottom portion of the rack clamped to the supports welded to the van. And I'm going to start making the platform that will actually support the batteries themselves. So in order to do that, I'm just going to have all my pieces of angle cut to size. I will level them off and weld directly to the removable vertical supports, the ones that are going to be a part of the bottom portion of the rack. So now the battery rack is really starting to take shape, and it'll take just a minute to get all these supports for the batteries in place, so hold tight just a minute while that's finished up. In this next step, I'm going to be drilling 2 half-inch holes into each of the 12 vertical supports. Now I say 12 vertical supports because there are 6 vertical supports welded to the van itself, and there are another 6 vertical supports that are a part of the bottom portion of the battery rack. The bolts, nuts, and washers that I am using are all grade 8 zinc coated, half-inch in size. They are very strong and will resist corrosion, which is why I'm going with them. And in order to get the holes drilled, I am drilling a little pilot hole and going through 2 vertical supports at a time as they are clamped together. And now for the most exciting part of the build for me is pulling down the rack itself and really starting to see it take shape. I'm going to weld in the center supports and finish the welds on all of the joints of the rack so everything's nice and sturdy. Then prep for enamel and primer and go ahead and primer and enamel it. You'll see me test fit the batteries and wire everything up and put it up there. So really exciting to get to those stages and see everything kind of start to come together. This was many hours of work, so it's hard to be patient sometimes. Here you'll see the conduit that's going through the floor of the van. This conduit is going to protect the wires going from the back of the van down to the batteries. Here's the method that I used to get the batteries under the van, being that the batteries in rack weigh about 250 pounds. It's a little bit hard to maneuver. So I went ahead and jacked the van up from the trailer hitch just to give myself a little bit of space in the back. I then put the batteries and rack onto the jack and rolled them into place, making sure that everything was lining up where I wanted. And I barely got the vertical supports of the bottom portion of the rack lined up in place so that I knew everything would go together. And then I started finishing off all the wiring for the batteries, making sure they were in series parallel. So I get my 12 volts, 450 amp hours, and also putting in the battery temperature sensor and the shunt so that my battery monitor can monitor the batteries. So getting all that in place was really awesome. The one thing I didn't show on video was the conduit going over the wires themselves, and you'll see that in the end clip. I made sure that the wires going down to the batteries were completely covered with conduit to protect them, and that they were restrained so that they won't be flopping around everywhere. That's really important so that nothing gets damaged while we're driving, obviously. The other thing that was done for protection of the batteries that wasn't really well shown in the video is that I put aluminum plate down below each of the batteries so nothing can hit the batteries from below if any rocks are kicked up from the road. I also put an aluminum plate in the front, and that aluminum plate was screwed to the frame of the van as well as the battery rack so that any oncoming rocks or debris would not hit the batteries. On the sides, I used a netting that's meant for the bottom of fish tanks, and that's so everything can still breathe really well, but anything that comes in from the sides will just be deflected and the impact won't be on the batteries. There's a small likelihood that you'll get things coming in from the side, so I felt that it was adequate enough having the aluminum on the bottom and front and then having the netting on the side. A couple other things worth mentioning about the installation of the batteries is once I had all the wiring in place, I also put a significant amount of terminal protector on each of the battery terminals. That's to help prevent them from corroding and oxidizing. The final thing is that these are Trojan T-105s. They're deep cycle lead acid batteries. They do need to be watered. And so you might think that it's very difficult to water all four of these batteries, being that they're hard to reach, but I actually have a watering system installed on them. So there's a small nozzle that comes out near the trailer hitch, and I simply hook up a little tube to that about once a month and put the other end of the tube into my distilled water, and I just lightly pump it until I can no longer pump, and all the batteries get watered at one time. It's a really convenient way of watering these batteries. The reason I went with flooded batteries, which a lot of people will not do, is simply because of cost. They are extremely durable and they're great batteries. But, I bought these batteries new for $520. AGMs with the same amp hour and everything would have cost me probably double that, if not 3 times the amount, and lithium ion would have been prohibitively expensive. So I ended up going with these just to save money, and they've worked really well. Even though this rack has only been installed for about 6 to 7 months, I've still used the batteries themselves for almost 2 years. So they've been great, and I know there's a lot of fear-mongering out there, but I've really appreciated having these batteries and the cost savings that I got from them. So this was the build process of the battery rack, and like I said, I was so excited to finally get this done. It had been on my list for over a year, and I had tinkered with the idea and messed around with it, but just hadn't gotten it done. So really, really happy. We've traveled about 20,000 miles with this battery rack underneath the van itself, and everything's held up perfect. It's been awesome. So really happy with the way it turned out, and you'll see in the final clip all the little aspects of what it looks like in the very end. So I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please remember to like the video, share it if you can, if you know someone who'd be interested, comment, subscribe to our channel for some more build projects. I really appreciate everyone who does that because it helps us out. So I hope you liked the video, and we'll see you next time.